Hello and welcome to the optional supplementary podcast for Sociology of Sexualities, Sociology 3U03 at McMaster University. I'm Tina Fetner. Today's module is Module 5 on sexuality and inequality. And you probably have noticed that it is a dense, thick module. There's lots of information on a number of topics where sexuality and inequality intersect. And so I thought that in order to keep to my more 25-minute kind of goal for this recording, I wouldn't talk about all 4 topics in this week's module, but just really dig into 2 of them. And so that's what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to skip over the first 2 topics in the module and talk in a little bit more depth about 2 of the more complicated, complex ways that sexuality produces inequality and results from inequalities that are pre-existing. So the first topic of this video is colonization, state formation, and sexuality in Canada. And in your module, you'll be pointed to a reading, if you haven't done it already, that gives you some greater details about particular stories of the process of colonization and the creation of the Canadian state, in the sort of early days of Canada, and the way that deep surveillance of the Indigenous peoples of Canada was a part of the process of colonization, and how sexuality played a role in that surveillance and that social control of Indigenous populations. Some of the reading and this topic itself, of course, is quite disturbing in some. It's a heavy topic, and so although we won't be going into too many dark details, I think that this is definitely a topic that will leave you with some food for thought as you go about your day. We're going to start with the idea of colonization, and I especially want to kind of trouble or problematize the way that we usually think about colonization. Right, when we learn about the history of Canada as a colony, in the way that colonizing forces, both from the Great Britain and from France, set up settlements here in Canada, usually we learn about changes in land and changes in governance. So changes in land mean that who owns land, who occupies a territory, how the treaty system and formal and informal agreements between settling populations and Indigenous populations created new ways that land was distributed across populations. A lot of times it has a very violent history, right? Wars are often about the borders, contests over the borders, about one nation's land and another nation's land. And the same with the history of colonizing Indigenous lands. There's often stories of violence and injustice that are kind of buried by the way that we talk about it, which is that, great British settlers came and they settled here, and then the Indigenous people sort of scooted over for them, and it all seems quite lovely, but the reality is a bit different from that. And then the other thing is we talk about governance practices, and this is almost always presented in a way where as if governance was introduced to land spaces, right? So the Indigenous governance practices are almost always rendered invisible in these stories of developing colonial practices on Canadian territories, or on territories that would become what we know as Canada today. And of course, there were governance practices existing before in Indigenous peoples, and the governance practice of different Indigenous nations are going to have different stories, right? It's complicated. It's not just singular in nature, right? And so imposing governance on Indigenous peoples is part of what I want to talk about today when it comes to sex and sexuality. Just give me a moment, I'll get there. All right, so I want to draw out the ways that colonization involved the manipulation, the physical relocation, and the restriction of the freedoms of indigenous populations. And like I said, the reading that you'll have for this week will give you additional details on the specifics of how the sort of bureaucrats in the colonial government made this come to fore. What I want to highlight in this topic is the way that sex and sexuality has always been entangled with this project of manipulation, surveillance, relocation, and imposing restrictions on indigenous peoples. Right? So this, we're sexualities class, we're going to draw that out. And then I also want to draw your attention to the way that this is embedded in religious practices of the colonizers, right? So in the case of French colonizers, this is the Catholic Church. But in the case of the Great British colonizers, which is related to the reading that you have for today, this is the Church of England that became the Anglican Church, and really spread out to religious practices of all kinds of Christian Protestant religions that kind of colluded with the state and pressured the state to include restrictions on indigenous people's sexuality as a part of the practice of governing indigenous peoples through a colonization practice. So I'm hoping that arriving at this class, you will already be familiar with the Indian Act of 1876, which is where the Canadian government formalized its practice of controlling the lives of First Nations peoples, right? And so made kind of a pact with Indigenous peoples that Canada and the government that was new and coming to these lands would offer education, would allow First Nations people to use their lands. They would provide social services and healthcare services, and imposed, of course, the residential school system. So all of these, you can imagine, seemed like they held a lot of promise to bring benefits to Indigenous peoples. And now, looking back and reflecting 100 and some years later, we really see that these sort of promises of giving benefits to Indigenous peoples really weren't carried through in a way that benefited Indigenous peoples. They were carried out in a way that they were actions of social control by the Canadian government, right? And so even educational practice and the practice of became the practice of withdrawing children from their families and putting them in residential schools where they were mistreated and underfed, and where the entire goal of the residential school system was to rob these children's indigeneity out of them, to take the cultural practices of Indigenous peoples out of them, to stop them from speaking their native languages, start speaking the languages of the colonizing forces, and to try to basically eliminate Indigenous peoples' cultures from Canada. So really a tool of social control and misuse. One of the ways that sexuality became entangled up with the concept of the Indian Act in 1876 was because part and parcel of this act was identifying who, quote unquote, counts as, quote unquote, Indian, right? Which is how Indigenous peoples have been referred to by the governmental documents of Canada from the beginning. So who counts as deserving of these benefits that I showed on the last slide? Who counts as belonging to a particular family? As we mentioned at the very beginning of this course, sex and sexuality play a very strong role in the definition of family, right? Who's a married couple, whose children belong to whom, who is appropriately constituting a household. Our whole understanding of kinship is centered around the sexual relationship between marital partners. And this is a system, of course, that was imposed on Indigenous people by the colonizing forces. And so some of the ways that gender and sexuality merged to count some indigenous peoples as worthy and deserving of benefits and others as not, were revealed by certain aspects of the act. For example, women were not counted as individuals at this time, and so they simply just absorbed the status of first their parents, and then when they got married, their husbands. And so their sort of status as indigenous or non-indigenous was marked by their sexual relationship to men, right? So when they got married, that sexual relationship was counted as official and real, and other kinds of social arrangements and sexual arrangements were not counted as real. So this leaves some people out, right? It definitely leaves out two-spirit individuals and really any individuals that don't have a marital relationship, right? Oh, well, men can, but any unmarried women, anyone who's living outside of the kind of heteronormative marital structure wasn't eligible to sort of count as deserving of these benefits. The Department of Indian Affairs, and perhaps that also should be in weird scare quotes, but that's the official department of the bureaucracy of Canadian colonization, created a system in which bureaucratic agents were the regulators of Indigenous women's sexuality. And as you'll see from your reading, there was a very intense amount of scrutiny on women's sexuality, Indigenous women's sexuality, and there was a very high level of social control. And so when women's sexuality did not conform to the expectations of the colonizing agents, right, they were subject to very serious, harsh penalties, right? So the agents had the power to control treaty payments. They had the power to withhold money from individual families. They had the power to take the children away from Indigenous women that they saw as insufficiently regulating their sexuality around colonial norms. They also had control over women's own resources, right? And so when Indigenous women had a savings account or had some money that they had that belonged to them, this was also controlled by the agents of the Department of Indian Affairs. So getting access to your own money was also controlled through this system. And then, as you'll see from your reading, in the most extreme cases, they actually could be jailed for non-criminal offenses that the agents were just simply had the power to decide that if a woman wasn't sufficiently sexually loyal to her husband or spent too much time at other people's houses or didn't seem like an appropriate wife, or if her husband was behaving inappropriately, this often also was seen as her fault because she didn't create a sort of home that was sexually satisfying enough to him. That was her job, and so controlling her husband was part of her responsibility as well. I had very intense powers of social control. And so women's sexuality became one of several ways that surveillance of Indigenous peoples really intensely was deeply surveilled and deeply controlled by colonial forces, right? And so women's access to their own sexual agency, their own identity, their own sexual preferences, all of this was rendered irrelevant in this colonial context, and the sort of imposing social and sexual norms around what was considered right and proper was deeply imposed on Indigenous peoples. And what I want you to think about was the way that sex and sexuality became a tool for social control under the conditions of colonization and state formation. Another sort of aspect of the intersection of sexuality and inequality in the conditions of state formation and colonization is family formation. Right? So colonial forces, these Department of Indian Affairs agents, had control over marriage and divorce practices of indigenous peoples as well, right? So this is another aspect of social control that the colonial governments imposed on indigenous peoples, right? But it was especially important and especially controlling for indigenous women, right? For women, marrying a white man or non-status man meant that they lost access to Indian status, where they got healthcare payments, Social Security, social services, etc. And it also created a situation where they became outcast to their peoples, right? And so women who wanted to marry non-status men were no longer allowed by colonizing forces to live on the reserve. What's more, their children, if they had them, also lost their status when women decided to orient their sexuality around a marital partnership to a non-status person. So once again, robbing sexual agency from indigenous women and having these intensely serious consequences for sexual choices of indigenous women. So women's sexuality, the stakes were very high, including whether you got to live with your extended family, whether you got to be a part of your community, whether your children had access to educational and health care. Really very high stakes on the sexual choices of indigenous women. Right? This also was the case if an indigenous woman wanted to marry an indigenous man who was in a different band, right? And so marrying outside of your band of origin meant that you lost status in that band and you were required to move to your husband's reserve. And so just really a lot of social control, a lot of lack of freedom of movement, a lot of imposed, all tied up with the sexual choices of indigenous women. Okay, so think about those issues as you're reading for today. I'm going to make a move on to a related topic. The last topic of the module is a topic of how race, class, gender, and it may also have put heterosexuality as intersecting social institutions that produce social inequalities, right? So obviously our example of colonization and state formation and the kind of intense surveillance of indigenous women's sexuality can be folded into this lesson as well. And I wanted to bring your attention to the idea that this is a larger practice than just affecting any one group of people. Right, so if we're looking at the intersection of race, class, and gender, we have to think about the way that sexuality and sexual history are entangled with the social hierarchies and the social institutions that we've identified so far. So just recall, and I really need you to remember this, that a social institution is a set of rules that organizes the behavior of a large group of people. Right? And so if you think of race, class, gender, and heterosexuality as intersecting social institutions, you'll think of them as intersecting systems of rules that produce hierarchical inequalities. Right? In this case, you'll see that there are economic inequalities, you see that there are racial inequalities, inequalities of social class, and gender inequalities. Right? Tied up with this are ongoing social processes that are created through struggles for power, wealth, and status, and that operate on the collective level, right, rather than the individual level. So we're not talking about any particular individual person that's looking to use these social inequalities to their own personal gain, although that is happening as well. What we're looking at in terms of a level of analysis here are the way that social groups use their collective position of power or their collective wealth or their collective social status to use sexuality as a tool to mark other groups as less than and to boost themselves and put themselves in this position of increased power, increased wealth, and increased social status. I have two policy examples that we can talk through to see how these kind of large-scale social processes work. They're both Canadian, and the first one is located in Ontario here. I'm going to talk about a particular policy called the Female Refuges Act of Ontario, and then we're going to talk about the way that abortion policy was implemented in the beginning and the reasons for that. Okay, all of this is to give us lessons about the way that power has used sexuality to reproduce itself, right? The way that social control has targeted certain groups of people, right? And I'd like to draw your attention to the way that there is a pattern to the way that social control has been imposed, right? If you understand that there are systems of social inequality that are class, race, and gender based, then that means for each of those systems, there's winners and losers, right? There are people that are higher up on the hierarchy, and there are people in groups that are lower down on the hierarchy. And in every case, when we see sexuality being used for increases in power, increases in wealth, or increases in social status, it's always the dominant group that is doing the social control and the group that is lower down on the hierarchy that is subject to social control. So we see social control of women by men, right? Social control of women's sexuality by men. We see social control of immigrant group sexuality by non-immigrants, right? Colonial powers. We see social control of interracial pairs by whites, and we see kind of extreme versions of imposing social control over sexuality, like practices of sterilization without consent, right, where groups of people have been targeted to render them infertile, right, where physical, surgical procedures are imposed on particular groups, like Indigenous women, for the most part, in Canada. In the U.S., there's also been targeted sterilization of Indigenous women on a very wide scale. But other people have been subject to sterilization as well. So people with intellectual disabilities, for example, have been subject to sterilization without informed consent. In the U.S., Black women have been subject to sterilization without their consent. And so once again, just trying to reveal kind of the power dimensions of social control of sexuality. There's also struggles over culture and status, right? Struggles over the meaning of sexuality, what is good sexuality, what is bad sexuality, what is virtuous, who counts as family, etc. So when we made a few weeks ago, when you made the sexual hierarchies, right, you were thinking about issues of what is good sexuality, what is healthy sexuality, what is valuable or virtuous sexuality, and what is bad and unhealthy and harmful, right? And I want you to think about the extent to which the sexual behaviors at the top of your social hierarchy were also related to other kinds of social hierarchies of race, class, and gender, right? So were your highly valued sexual behaviors at the very top of your social hierarchy associated with meanings of sexuality that supported the cultures and ways of life of powerful groups in our contemporary culture? And were the lower down sexual behaviors in the middle of the sexual hierarchy or toward the bottom of the sexuality, were they associated with cultures, or were they associated with meanings of sexuality that were tied to groups that had that were not in dominant positions on the sexual hierarchies of race, class, and gender. Right? I think that I would like to leave this with you as an open question, because I think it's the kind of thing that you really need to sit back with and chew on and give some thought and think about the evidence that's all around you. Right? So rather than tell you this is the case, I want you to look for evidence and see whether you think that the social hierarchies of race, class, gender, and heterosexuality are consistent with the sexual hierarchies that you built at the beginning of the class. To the extent that it is, right, you're making an argument that sexuality is an organizing force that's consistent with these other organizing social forces. Right? So we'll leave it there for a minute, and we're going to talk about these two examples that I already told you we're going to talk about. The first one is the Female Refuges Act of Ontario. Right? This was a policy that was put into place after Ontario was established, right? So after a period of colonization, when a few cities had emerged in Ontario. So we had cities in Toronto, obviously, as a major place, York, Waterloo, Hamilton, all kinds of cities that were kind of a little bit farther apart from each other than they are now, both because of urban spread, but also because of the transportation options that were available around the turn of the century, 1900s. Ontario decided to implement a new law that allowed for women to be sent to a women's jail, a minimum security correctional institution, just for failing to conform to the sexual expectations of the day, right? And so it allowed, what it did was it allowed for young adult women's, unmarried women's parents, married women's husbands, or just agents of the state of whatever kind, so police or local land-owning lords, etc., could decide that women were being incorrigible in some way and could sentence them without a trial and without any crime happening to a minimum security correctional institution for several years. In 1919, the maximum sentence was reduced to 2 years from 5, and but it allowed any person at all to bring charges forward against any woman. So if you think about it, what kind of charges would create a situation where women could just be put in jail for no apparent reason? This was a targeted legal power that dealt with the concern that was around the idea that immigrant women didn't have the same sexual morality as more established women who had been born here in Ontario. And I say that with knowing full well that Ontario had only existed for a few decades at this point, right? So this is a way that we can divide immigrant groups from Native groups, but there was also a racialized component to this, right? And so a lot of the immigrants were from different parts of Europe than Great Britain, right? And so this was targeting immigrants from Ireland. This was targeting immigrants from Eastern Europe, right? So people that we think of as white today, but at the turn of the century were really marked as other in the same way that racialized processes, mark different kinds of human from different from powerful groups, right? The same kind of social process. So immigrants were here, they're poor, they're arriving in urban centers in large numbers, and they include unmarried women who had the audacity to do things like drink in a pub or walk alone at night. And the concern was that there was some prostitution going on and that we really had to deal with that as a massive social problem. And so really what the smart thing to do was to just lock up all the women and remove women's freedoms from their, women from access to their freedom of movement, right? And so this was all a big sexual panic. And it all was around the idea that having quote-unquote loose women wandering around the streets of cities was a scourge on Ontario, and that we need to solve it by locking these women up. This act was in place all through the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it stayed on the books until 1958 when it was finally removed. There was several decades when it was sort of on the books and nobody was actually arrested for it. But that's a very long time to have to give the state the power and all the men in the world the power to just lock up a woman. Let me just add one more thing to the second bullet point, the idea that any person can bring charges forward against any woman. I just want to remind you that in Canada, that this was a gendered concept before the person's case. And so in 1919, any person referred only to male citizens and not to women. So it was just men being able to lock women up for their sexual indiscretions, or their, before they even had the chance to have any sexual indiscretions. Okay, that's one example of how we're willing to use sexuality to target the behavior of a subaltern group, have the dominant group impose not just their sexual norms, but also restrictions on the freedoms of, in this case, immigrant women, and to use the power of the state to back that up. Another example that I'd like to draw out is abortion policy. So this is a more explicitly sexual policy, right? One of the things that I think that is less well known about abortion policy is that in the very olden days, there was no law against abortion, not in the colonies, not in Great Britain. So the common law didn't have any laws against abortion. They had to write it new in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere throughout the Commonwealth. In Canada, abortion was declared illegal in 1869, right? So, fairly recently. And it stayed on the books until 1969. Right, so I want to talk about this period of 100 years of abortion being illegal and draw your attention once again to the relationship between the social hierarchies that existed at this time. 1869 was the same period of immigration rates, of the expansion of the population, of the colonial period of sort of extreme surveillance on indigenous populations and separation of indigenous populations from colonizing populations. And at this moment when large numbers of immigrants were arriving in Canada, this was the moment when abortion policy was imposed upon women, right? During moral panics about immigrant sexuality, during moral panics about the number of children that immigrants were having relative to the number of children that the middle class, more established colonizers were having, and the religious differences between the immigrant populations, and especially the Irish immigrant populations who were Catholic, as opposed to the Protestants who were in power in Ontario. Right, and so abortion was declared illegal in 1869 as a sort of part and parcel of this response to immigrants from low income, different religious groups, and different ethnic groups. Right, in 1969, the history of Canadian abortion policy was to make it illegal only in certain cases, and I think that you may be aware that the first abortion policies, the first set of abortion policies required hospitals to have a committee of doctors, of course, all of whom would be men, to decide if any individual woman should be allowed to get an abortion. And so, it's a sort of step toward reproductive choice, but only if the women weren't given the choice themselves. They weren't seen as having the intellectual capacity to make those kinds of decisions and the power over termination of pregnancy was given to hospital committees, right? And there was some social movement response to the inadequacy of that policy, right? In 1988, that law, the 1969 law, was struck down. And now the situation in Canada is that there are no legal obstacles to abortion at any stage, but at the same time, neither is there a sort of enshrined formal legal right to abortion, although that is becoming more and more the case as Health Canada is requiring provinces to include reproductive health care in the services that they provide to people in their provinces. And so there's been some recent court cases where more kind of entrenched provinces like Nova Scotia, who haven't provided abortion services to included them in their Medicare services, have failed challenges to Health Canada's requirement that they do so. And so soon they're going to be required to include abortion services in their reproductive health care moving forward. So that is kind of the way that it's becoming legally enshrined in policy. But in terms of like human rights policy of Canada, et cetera, abortion's not really named the way that struggles in the United States are around this kind of legal right to abortion. Here, it's more about access to abortion. That's what I want to talk about next. All right, so we might be moving toward a place where Health Canada is requiring provinces to give access. We're not quite there yet, and as I mentioned, some provinces do not pay for abortion services, but they just lost a court case, and so this is about to change soon. But regardless of that particular policy, we still have a situation where women who are rural or live in sparsely populated areas often have to travel really far for abortion services and really have trouble getting access to abortion. And so even though there's not illegal obstacles, there are these real practical obstacles. And there are also a few practices that really make it difficult for some women, depending on where they live, to make that choice about their own reproduction. One of the things that has exacerbated the lack of access to abortion services for Canadian women is a very slow approval process for RU486. This is a combination of a combination pill that that is considered a medical abortion as opposed to a surgical abortion, right? So even though in other countries, RU486 has been approved by the regulatory systems for decades. It took all the way until 2015 to approve RU486, and even so, it was highly regulated then, so required a doctor's prescription. But until very recently, it required an ultrasound to determine the stage of pregnancy, right? Because RU486 only works for the first several weeks of pregnancy. And so this meant that women had to get to a physical clinic to get an ultrasound and get an appointment within the time that they would still be eligible for RU486. So things like waiting lists, things like travel, and the cost associated with getting transportation to a place where they could get an ultrasound still put lots of barriers in place, even for women's access to RU486. They just very recently eliminated the ultrasound, but they still have this as a doctor visit, prescription only, and not more easy to access kind of pharmacist level of distribution. And so are still pretty serious access problems when it comes to pregnancy termination in Canada. I want you to think about those two examples, and as you're thinking about that, I want you to think about how power and sexuality intersect and work together, right? So one of the ways I want you to think about this is in terms of understanding processes of social control, right? And who is subject to social control and who gets to be the one making decisions that impact other humans, right? And that it is often not just an individual social control where one person controls another, but we can see the patterns where whole social groups like women, immigrants, right, interracial pairs, and sterilization, and then you turn back to the idea of culture and status, and really think through these examples and think about the meanings of sexuality, thinking about who gets to be virtuous, and thinking about what a family looks like. I want to make the argument, or I want you to think about, right, how sexuality underlies racial, gender, and class hierarchy. Right? I personally am convinced that sexuality is an important tool in providing foundations for racial, gender, and class hierarchies of colonizer versus indigenous, hierarchies of men versus women, hierarchies of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant colonizers versus Catholic Irish immigrant groups, et cetera, and that this plays out in patterned ways all over. I also want to make the case that race, gender, and class sort of underlie the norms and meanings of sexuality, right? So the way that we understand particular kinds of sexuality to be good and right and healthy are reliant on our race, class, and gender hierarchies, right? So I want you to think about the way that historically the people in power, whatever their sexual norms look like, whatever the way that they define the meanings around sex and sexuality are, that those are the kinds of norms that get to determine the sexual hierarchy. I'm going to leave you with the question, does sexuality organize the social world in concert with race, class, and gender? Chew on that as you think about Module 5. So I'm going to leave you with some instructions to complete Module 5. You have some really good readings. It might be a bit longer this week than usual, but there's just so much to learn and so much to think about that I think that you'll really enjoy it all. And then once you've done all the readings, you can dazzle the weekly quiz with your exquisite expertise because you will know so many things. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week for Module 6.